Hi all, Dr. Clark here again, and today for Fish and Wildlife Management, I'm going to lecture on Charles Darwin and his early life. Now, you might ask yourself, maybe you won't ask yourself, what does Charles Darwin have to do with fish and wildlife management? Well, hopefully by the end of my kind of two-part lecture series on Charles Darwin, I'll talk about his early life, and then I'll talk about his adult life, I guess you could call his scientifically publishing life. You'll realize that Darwin was a lot more than just a individual who wrote about evolution. He was a active naturalist, and what we would think of a naturalist today is what we would say, instead of, we don't normally call them naturalists today, we call them ecologists. And that's what a manager is really an ecologist. An ecologist that is trying to manage some kind of animal community, some kind of plant community, in some cases some kind of fungal community. That's what a manager does, and they're nothing more, or I shouldn't say nothing less, than an ecologist. And that's what Charles Darwin was an ecologist. And hopefully by showing you kind of his upbringing and the route that he went, you'll understand where that information is coming from. All right, so let's get started. This is Charles Darwin, clearly not his early life. There are not very many photographs of Charles Darwin when he was really young. So I threw a picture on him anyways. Well, so first, let's see kind of what you do know. And most of you have heard some information about Charles Darwin. So I'll just click through a few things and try to kind of get you to think about, while you're watching this lecture, what you actually know about Charles Darwin, and his role that he plays, not in not only in evolutionary biology but also ecology and management, etc. So first of all, here's a picture of Charles Darwin, one of the younger pictures of Charles Darwin. This is kind of the picture that Charles had painted of him right before he went on the voyage of the Beagle. So he was 22 when he went on the voyage of the Beagle. So a fairly young man. Okay. Most of you know that Darwin's famous for what we call Darwin's finches, which are Galapagos finches, and his documentation of feeding adaptations of finches, or what we call adaptive radiation. Okay. He's famous for his work that he did on the Voyage of the Beagle, or the HMS Beagle, which was a boat that was contracted or hired out to map the coastlines of South America. Well, the coastlines of all the continents, but mainly South America. And Darwin was a naturalist on that boat. Also a little bit famous for his work with Galapagos tortoises, okay, and his ability to determine what island each tortoise came from by the shape of their shell. And then notably, obviously, he is known for the publication on the origins of species. Okay, and we'll talk more about all of this as we progress. Okay, part of that origins of the species is the single photograph or single picture in the entire book, which is of kind of a dichotomous tree, or a evolutionary tree, with one species giving rise to a bunch of different forms. And then famously, Charles Darwin wrote, I think, at the top. And so, again, we'll talk about what this means for management. Okay, and then notably, he gets tied directly into primate evolution or human evolution, and he did do quite a bit of work later in his life on facial expressions of humans and how they compared to other primates uh, by examining different muscles and other things that the different primates have versus humans, and seeing if all the organisms have the capability of, having the same facial expressions as humans. So, can chimpanzees and gorillas and things like that, can they frown? Can they smile? Can they, and is it just a result of the muscle attachments, or is it a result of something else? And so Darwin wrote an entire book on that material, which is important for primatology. And if you're a manager of a region where there are primates other than humans, can be hugely important for that role. All right, so let's first talk a little bit about Darwin's family and kind of the history of Charles Darwin. Um, okay, so when we talk about this, the details aren't super important, except for kind of realizing that his upbringing was an upbringing of learning is important kind of thing, and that education is very important. Now, his father had uh, deemed, what kind of education was important for his children, but nonetheless, education in the Darwin family was of utmost importance, and so all the children were allowed to go to school, and more like made to go to school, made to pick a field that was of interest to their father, and whatnot. And so you'll see some of those aspects, and I'll hit on some of those points as we progress. Okay, so he was born kind of the fifth of six children. Um, his father was Robert Waring Darwin, and his father was a physician. He was a doctor. Okay, so that's one of the fields that was notable, or was a field that Darwin or any of the children could enter, and that would be a physician, a doctor. His mother, Susan Wedgwood, um, Susanna Wedgwood, and he didn't know her because she died when he was 8 years old. Um, and so Darwin was really raised by uh, family members, but mainly raised by the servants or the help. I shouldn't call them servants, because that's one thing I want to make sure that you understand, that we're talking about the 1800s, where a lot of people had slaves, but not the Darwin family. The Darwin family was fairly wealthy, but they did not believe in slavery. So they paid their servants. They had live-in servants that were paid, and they did not have slaves. And that you can see that tone as Darwin progresses, with his thought processes, in human evolution. You can see that tone where he did not feel that different races of humans uh, warranted any differences. Like he realized that there is only one species of humans, and that whether you're black, white, tan, whatever, really didn't make a difference. And he got that from his father and his grandfather. So let's talk about his grandfather first, Ernest Darwin. Darwin, he was also a physician. Okay, he is a very famous physician. In fact, that George the Third, or King George the Third, wanted him to be his physician, and he turned it down, mainly because he didn't want to live in that region. But where Darwin got a lot of his ideas around evolution and his education came from his grandfather, Ernest Darwin. Now, Ernest Darwin used the term evolution way before Darwin did. He was a philosopher, and he was a slave trade. Um, I guess you could say he wanted to abolish slave trade, but he did it from a different kind of point of view. He wrote poetry about having slaves and or about not having slaves and the cruelty behind having slaves, and he wrote a lot about it. So it, he openly discussed it, but he also wrote many articles and many poems about the abolishment of slavery. So, like I said, he's a poet. He got Darwin got a lot of his botanical information or his love for nature from his grandfather. So Linnaeus, who you probably know, the individual that created the classification system that we still use today, the kingdom, phylum, class classification system, along with genus, species, epithets. Um, Charles' grandfather translated works from Linnaeus for the Botanical Society. So, a lot of it was written in Latin from Linnaeus's point of view, and it was transferred into English. Right? He spoke on evolution, not to the degree that Charles Darwin did, but nonetheless, like I said before, Charles Darwin did not coin the term evolution. He was not the first to use the term evolution. He wasn't the first to talk about evolution. A lot of Englishmen talked about, especially philosophers, talked about the fact that species had the ability to change. Now, in some cases, this ability to change was in regards to, a higher being doing the changing. And in other cases, some of the individuals were less religious and just accepted the change of an organism without the act of a higher being. I'm not going to read this uh, poetry to you, but this is a poem that Ernest Darwin wrote about abolishing slavery. And you can see that, he really tied into the components of the hardship for the slave. So the innocent cries, covered in blood, the earth is covered in blood due to slavery. And he really wanted people to get rid of slaves. And this component, and I can't drive home this component too much. This plays a huge role in Charles Darwin's life, in the fact that his father and his grandfather did not own slaves and were against slavery, because when Charles Darwin went to different countries, where he went to South America and he saw individuals that would be treated as slaves in Europe, or he went to Africa and he saw individuals that would be treated as slaves in Europe. He didn't think of them as slaves or as a lesser group of people, lesser race. He thought of them as adapted to the current environment. And that played a big role in his writings. Now, I have to talk a little bit about the Wedgwood family, mainly because you're going to see some links between Charles Darwin and Aldo Leopold, mainly because in today's society, we think of incest as, as a bad word, or as something that you would never do. It's something that it's just unthinkable acts. But you remember, even in the 1800s and even into the 1900s, incest was extremely common, and especially in regions where uh, there was a different class system, a drastic different class system. Rich people and poor people. Rich people would never marry poor people, and so they married within kind of their clique or within their circle, and often they were marrying their own cousins. And that's the case with the Wedgwood family. So Joshua Wedgwood is Charles Darwin's father-in-law. Um, he was a potter, and he was also an abolishment or slave abolisher. Um, and so that's one of the reasons why the families were attracted to each other. Uh-oh. So you can't see this, but uh, Charles Darwin's father, or sorry, Ernest Darwin, his grandfather, married Sarah Wedgwood, which was his cousin. Okay? So that kind of started this connection between the Darwin family and the Wedgwood family. Okay? So then Robert Warning Darwin, or Darwin's father, was born. Okay? He was a medical doctor. Okay? Um, and I guess he was a very successful medical doctor, you could say. Before the age of 20, he had already set up his own practice, had multiple patients within the first 6 months. Okay, and uh, and again, uh, just like his father before him, um, he married into the Wedgwood family, or the Wedgwood family married into the Darwin family. So this kind of started this pattern of incestual relationships. Okay? So Susanna Darwin and Robert Darwin, they had 6 children. These would be Charles Darwin's parents. Okay, so um, again, you can see as we kind of go down this, and that Caroline Darwin married her cousin Joshua Wedgwood. Charles Darwin married his cousin Susanna Wedgwood. And so you can see that there's a lot of ancestral relationships going on during this time. Charles Darwin's mom died of stomach cancer in 1817 when Darwin was about 8 years old. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about Darwin's life um, and how that mentality of his father and his grandfather kind of played in to his life. So he was born on the 12th of February in 1809. Again, like I said, his mother died when he was 8 years old or so, and Charles was raised by servants and his older sisters when they were around. But it's important to note that Darwin was raised wealthy or well endowed, and so he had the opportunity to go to the very best schools. And so he entered school at Samuel Butler School, and he was there for 7 years. It's kind of a private school. Uh, he then went to the University of Edinburgh, right, when he was 16. And like I said before, his father was choosing what his son should do as an occupation. And his father's first choice for Charles was a medical doctor. So after Darwin went to school, he entered the university as a medical student. And so he took medical courses. When he was there, though, fortunate for Darwin, he met Robert Grant. Robert Grant was a naturalist, which we would call, like I said before, an ecologist. And Grant studied marine animals. So Darwin naturally kind of flocked to Grant's uh, because he got to do outdoor research. And that's what Charles Darwin really liked. Charles Darwin is notorious for being absent from class or leaving class like after lunch or during lunch and not coming back. And he wasn't like he was, going home or anything like that. He was going into nature. And walking through the woods and collecting things, and that's what that's kind of how Charles Darwin started his career as a naturalist. Was he was naturally inclined to be interested in nature, and that was probably from his grandfather. His grandfather was really interested in plants and being a naturalist himself. So Robert Grant allowed Darwin peak for this studying of animals to increase, um, and and that kind of just, I guess you could say, snowballed. Um, Darwin not only knew that he wanted to be a naturalist, um, he knew that he didn't want to be a doctor, and there's multiple reasons for this, but it said that Charles Darwin was kind of afraid of blood, or he got at least sick when he saw lots of blood. And you can imagine in the early 1800s, during this time period, where there's no anesthetics and kind of the actual mentality of the medical field was still pretty brutal at the time. So medical school was not for Charles Darwin. So he didn't like the sight of blood. He didn't like the medicine piece of it. So he dropped out. Well, this made his dad extremely mad. And so his dad said, well, the only other respectable job or respectable position for a wealthy young man, or kind of an individual growing up in a wealthy family, the only other respectable job is to be a clergyman or to work for the church. So Darwin was admitted to Christ College in Cambridge in 1827, and much like his role in the medical field or in the medical school, he didn't like it. He wasn't interested in uh, Christ College. He wasn't interested in the teachings of that college at all, except for the fact that during the early 1800s, most of the clergymen, most of the religious individuals, they were also the individuals that were documenting creatures. So they were going out and they were collecting plants and insects and animals, and they were categorizing them and classifying them according to Linnaeus's classification system. And Charles Darwin would go on these little adventures, and he loved it. And that was by far his favorite part of the entire college. He didn't really care about much of the rest, and he kept leaving class to keep collecting beetles and things like that. Well, he eventually started making friends with John Henslow. Just a picture of John Henslow here. Okay, and Henslow was a botanist, and realized that Charles Darwin had this knack for collecting things, analyzing things. What we would call today an ecologist. That's what Charles Darwin was in his younger age. He had this love for the outdoors and the classification of organisms. So in 1829, Charles Darwin was 20 years old, and that's the first time that we see his name appear in scientific literature. Okay? And it appeared with illustrations um, of beetles and other things from a couple famous entomologists in the region. Okay, Leonard Jennings and Frederick Hope. Okay. So Darwin, pretty young, 20 years old, started to realize his knack for writing about the scientific world. In 31, Charles passed all of his examinations, not well. Again, like I said before, he was skipping class a lot, and he didn't really have a knack for the religious piece of his education. He really wanted the naturalist piece of his education. So even though he passed all of his examinations, he was supposed to remain at Cambridge for additional terms to complete all the requirements. Okay? And at that time, after he passed, he actually received a letter from Peacock and Henslow that was basically introducing him and telling him that he should go on this Beagle voyage, that they were looking for a naturalist, someone that would be willing to collect plants and animals and things like that, and that he should think about this. Okay? Now, this is where kind of the story depends on where you read, okay, but this is the interesting kind of piece. Darwin was not the first choice by any means. Leonard Jennings was probably the first choice, but it's said that he was not the first choice and probably was the last choice. But nonetheless, you got to realize Charles was really young, and he wanted to go on this voyage extremely bad. So he asked his father and if he could go on the voyage of the Beagle, and because at the time, Darwin had to actually pay to go on the voyage. He had to pay to be the naturalist on the ship. It wasn't like they were paying him. He had to pay to go on this. And so he had to come up with the money. He didn't have the money. He asked his father, and his father said no at first, but then his father had this little caveat to it. He said that if you can find one individual that I respect as a physician that says that you should go on this voyage, then I will pay for you to go on this voyage. Okay? Charles Darwin asked his soon, within five years after the voyage, or a year after the voyage, sorry, his father-in-law, Wedgwood, who was well respected, if he should go on this, and he said absolutely, that this would be a great opportunity for a young man to see the world and to experience life. And so his father allowed him to go and paid the price. So in 1931, Charles Darwin met Captain Robert FitzRoy, and they made preparations for the voyage of the Beagle. Okay. And like I said, Charles was not the first choice. Leonard Jennings was. Charles probably was, 5 choices down or so. A lot of people rejected Robert FitzRoy, mainly from the perspective is FitzRoy promised that this would be a 2-year voyage. Yet they are going to map all the coastlines of South America and Africa and India, and they're going to map those coastlines so later on, when English ships were going to trade with these regions or take over these regions, they knew which ports they could use, etc., which ports were hostile, those kind of things. So most of the people who had already been on voyages, like Leonard Jennings, knew that FitzRoy was wrong, that there was no way they were going to finish the voyage in 2 years. Well, 2 years turned into 5 years, and so they were gone for a full 5 years. Um, and this is the voyage that they took. So if you see here, they left England, or they left Europe, and they traveled down, and they spent the majority of their time mapping South America. In fact, they didn't make it to the tip of the Cape before the 2 year mark. So they had already spent 2 years by the time they made it to the tip of South America. Yeah. And so you can see, I'll show you another map, but you can see that there's lots and lots of stops on, this side of South America, very few stops on this side of South America. They stopped in the Galapagos Islands for a total of 30 days. And then the rest of the trip was pretty much straight back, because FitzRoy obviously knew, hey, we're 2 years in and we did South America in about 2.5, 3 years. It's going to take us a long period of time, 2 years, to get all the way back. And indeed it did. So here you can see South America, lots of stops, lots of ports, okay, even lots of travels inland. And so Darwin wrote a lot about traveling inland, and documentation of fossils and things like that. A few ports on this side, and then the Galapagos Islands. So they visited quite a few Galapagos Islands. They didn't get them all. But they made it to quite a few Galapagos Islands. And again, like I said, he's most famous. Charles Darwin is most famous for the Galapagos Islands, but he literally only spent roughly 30 days in the Galapagos Islands. Okay, so when the Beagle reached the Galapagos Islands, it reached there in September 16th, 1835, and then it went to Tahiti on October 20th, 1835. So again, roughly 30 days or so, a little bit less. And what Darwin's most famous for is those 30 days of a 5 year trip. Now, the key component of this was that Darwin didn't like the Galapagos Islands at all. He despised them. He wrote numerous times about them that they're an awful place, but they had very strange creatures. And so you have to understand that as a naturalist in the 1800s, what that position meant was collection. You collected everything. So if there was a bird, you shot it, you packaged it, you collected it, and you'd either ship it back, or it'd sit on the ship until you got back to England. Okay? So Darwin, during his time on the ship, he was always sick, and we'll talk more about that at kind of a later date. But him and FitzRoy really kind of hit it off, and they started publishing articles together about the different tribes, about the different habitats, all kinds of things. And so Darwin was really actively writing while he was on the boat, especially after the Galapagos Islands, because after that, there's very few stops. For the last 2 years or so of the trip, there's very few stops that the Beagle made. Okay, so again, like I said, Darwin was 22 when he left England for the Voyage of the Beagle, and came back 27. I had numerous scientific papers that had already been in the works and just needed to be published, and he published them. And he wrote his first book. Most people don't know, but his first book was on the structure of atolls, or distribution of coral reefs, but it was really based on this idea that where you go in the Pacific and Atlantic Ocean and other places, when you go to these regions, you'll see a ring of coral. And there will be nothing on the inside but coral in a circle or in a ring or, somewhat ring-like circles. And they're called atolls. But how they formed was a mystery to most people because coral typically, when it forms, it needs to form in shallow water and it needs to be attached to hard surfaces. Well, what Darwin proposed and what actually happens is that there was a volcano there and the coral built around the volcano. Right? So it built a ring around the volcano. And the coral, remember, coral's living organisms, is a living animal that's laying down calcium carbonate. Okay? And so the coral would build around the island, and the island itself was being eroded because coral's alive. It can just keep building and rebuilding itself. So the coral might get damaged, but it would rebuild itself. But the island itself, the rock, is not going to rebuild itself unless it's an active volcano, and then you wouldn't have the coral ring form. But eventually the island erodes and it erodes down out of sight, and you get these pools of water that form, or I guess ponds with that are completely surrounded by coral called atolls. Right? And so Charles Darwin, his first book was about the formation and the ecology of atolls. Okay, so in 1837, when he got back from the voyage, now Darwin had a huge collection: insects and mammals and fossils and birds and amphibians and reptiles, and he had collected them all. And this is another component that most people don't understand: is Charles Darwin did not do the work himself. Charles Darwin was the best manager you could ever expect. Okay? He found the people that were specialists in all those areas, and he gave them his material, his collection, to help him identify them, classify them, etc. And that's what makes the best type of manager is an individual that is good at finding people who are very specific and professional in a given region and can add to the whole completion of a project. On top of that, Charles Darwin was a prolific letter writer. He would write letters and ask for data and information all over the world. I mean, there's estimates that he would write 20 letters a day, every day, to different scientists around the world, asking them about different concepts that they've seen, different data points that they've seen, what's it like in this region, etc. And a lot of that information is where he got information from for his books that he later wrote, on the origin of species, etc. Okay. So for fossil mammals, they went to Richard Owens. Richard Owen, just a little bit about him. He's the individual that coined the term dinosaurs. Okay. He's also the individual that was the curator of the Natural History Museum. And at first, Charles Darwin and Richard Owen were friends, but later, because Charles Darwin denounced a lot of the teaching of the church, in the sense that Charles Darwin did not believe that all organisms were created and that they couldn't change. Charles Darwin also did not accept that a higher being had an active hand in changing the organism. Richard Owens had a problem with this. Richard Owen was a devout Christian, and so those two started to hate each other. And there was a deep dislike or hatred towards each other from Charles Darwin and Richard Owens. Before that, Richard Owen actually named a fossilized sloth, a giant ground sloth, after Charles Darwin. Darwin collected it and gave that fossil to Owen to classify it, and Owen in return named it Darwinii. But nonetheless, these two men hated each other, and that deep hatred carried on until till they died. The modern mammals went to Waterhouse. He was a mammologist. Gould was a ornithologist or a bird biologist, and Gould was the individual who really told Darwin, look, what you're classifying on the Galapagos Islands, you classified this bird as a woodpecker, this is a warbler, this is a finch, this is as a sparrow. He told Darwin, these are all finches, every one of them. They just have different bill shapes and different kind of feeding habits, but they're all finches. And that's really what started that Darwin's finches, or the Galapagos finches evolution ideas in Darwin's head when he got information back by Gould saying, look, you classified these wrong. They're all finches. Fish went to Leonard Jennings. Okay. Reptiles and amphibians went to Thomas Bell. And Darwin controlled the insects. So Darwin kind of took a key liking to identifying insects, and so he did a lot of the work with insects. Okay. And so there was lots of things that he found, lots of extinct mammals that went to Owens, like these are Galaphodonts. These are giant armadillo-like creatures, and Darwin famously wrote in his book on the Voyage of the Beagle about Galaphodon fossils being in the bank of a river, and so he was sitting next to this river, and he saw these fossils of Galaphodons, these giant armadillos in the bank, and then on the surface of the bank, or on the other side of the bank, he saw modern armadillos running around, and he tied the two together that, hey, look, these things are so similar to each other. Yes, one is a giant, massive creature, and the other one's small, but their mannerism, their body form, their feeding was probably identical to each other. So a lot of those key components is what drove Darwin to writing about those pieces and the origin of species. All right, and so one of the other key components of Darwin's work, and we talked about this before, was that essay that Malthus wrote on the principles of populations in 1798. Remember, Malthus was writing about populations from a human perspective. So he's writing about human populations and the ability for humans to over-reproduce. And the fact that humans will reproduce more offspring than they ever have the opportunity to feed, and they'll out-reproduce their offspring or over-reproduce their offspring faster than they can grow crops. And this was kind of the principle of populations and early population biology by Malthus. Okay? Darwin wrote, here, then, I had at least got a theory by which to work. So a lot of this information that was in Malthus's book, Darwin connected to populations of all other organisms. And he realized that, hey, if humans have the ability to over-reproduce, so do other organisms. And that's indeed kind of what led to his descent with modification ideas in the origin of natural. origins of species. Okay, November 11th of 38, he proposed to Emma Wedgwood. They got married in 39, and that's when he had his first child, and he also finished his book Voyage of Beagle. If you haven't read Voyage of Beagle, I highly suggest it. It's a good book. It's really interesting about how in parts of the world, even since 1839, there's been little change in some parts of the world, and especially in South America. Okay, so with that, I'll talk about his later years after children and into basically into his scientific writing and how he devoted his life to science.